And if you demonize those people, and if you drive them to the right, but you tell men like there's something innately wrong with them, you destroy a whole population's revolutionary potential.
So do you think that's the factor behind the gender divide?
No. I disavow that completely. But I think that second wave feminism is about creating a gender divide that leaves women in the white collar world more competitive than men. If you look at socialist feminism, it's all about trying to create universal programs working with men to create better conditions for the working class. PMC, second wave feminism, was about optimizing workplace situations so that women could compete with men for the uppermost jobs.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Catherine Liu, author of the book Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. Catherine Liu is a professor at the University of California, Irvine. And I think your book was part of a broader array of books that sort of made me jump from the position of there's something wrong with the left, but I'm going to ignore it because the right is a bigger problem, and the culture war is a distraction. The latter of which I still kind of agree with.
Right.
But then increasingly it became clear to me that there's a serious problem on the left, and it actually has a material basis. It has a basis in class itself. And your book, along with the work of Christopher Lasch, was very instrumental in sort of clarifying this to me, and really that sort of awakening. And many people say, is the left too white? Is it too this? And I would say it is too white. It's too white collar, right?
Yeah.
And that's something you talk about. And I guess there's a lot of clarification there. But you're obviously have a PMC background yourself, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, first and foremost, kind of what led you to write this book, because it does. You have a scathing critique of this, and it's a short, and I want to say to the audience, it's a short book. You have no excuse not to read it. So you definitely should. But yeah, what made you, what was the kind of tipping point for you to write this?
The tipping point was probably the 2016 election when Hillary lost Trump 1.0. I'd been sort of doing straight on intellectual history, cultural theory, critical theory, and I'd always been very critical of this cultural populism in academic writing. I also became much more critical of the way that critical theory had given up on Marxism and embraced post-structuralism and post-modernity. But I think I was sort of in the closet about being a kind of dyed-in-the-wool, old-school Marxist in terms of understanding class as the one motivating contradiction that can change the relations of production in a society, and that can, really oppress people and exploit the majority of people with an ideological framework that keeps the majority of the people oppressed and exploited, and a minority of the people profiting from their labor. And I'd always kind of believed this, but I have to say, I came of age during a time of total reaction against against leftism. It was the rise of the right, Reagan, and then Clinton. And I mostly I tried to be very careful and play the game within academia and make, good arguments and criticize cultural populism and the culture wars as a betrayal of economic populism. This was in my last book, in Academic Idol, American Idol, Academic Elitism as Cultural Critique. And I'd always thought that we have to be more critical of ourselves within academia, our place in society. The long background to this probably has to do with the fact that, I went to China very often as a kid because my father was working at the UN. And one thing that I saw, front and center with the Cold War was the reality of the Chinese situation and the Cold War propaganda that I was being taught in schools. And I got into really big trouble in my AP World History class when I raised my hand and I said, this textbook is just not true. It said the Chinese were like little worker bees filing in and out of factories, in much the way that we characterize North Korea today. And, China was a very messed up place with the Cultural Revolution, everything else going on well into the 70s. But when I raised my hand in class and objected to the textbook, my teacher, Mrs. Schwartz, actually said, Kathy, you open up your mouth again, I'm going to put my size 8 shoe in it. Like, she literally silenced me. And I walked out of the class and I said, I'm not coming back in until you apologize. We had the counselor come in. My mom took my teacher's side because she's very authoritarian. And somehow we made it up. But that was a moment when I just thought, I'm not trusting anything. The ideological veil is something we need to throw off. But it takes a long time to do that when you're 14, 15, and no one's really supporting you. And everyone's telling you, like, liberalism is good. Freedom is good. America's a democracy. I wanted to believe, and you kind of have to. This is a really long way of getting back to my leftist roots also have to do with the fact that I am related to people who are workers, blue-collar workers. My uncle worked his entire life in a factory near Wuhan, in a city of 30,000 people outside of Wuhan. My aunt is a member of Unite Here Now. She's a hotel worker in New York City. I challenge you now to find any academic in America or Canada who has working class relatives within the extended family. I think that the class construction of academia and the liberal elites is more and more segregated and more so than it's ever been, in fact. And that kind of economic and credential segregation is as bad as racial segregation or gender segregation, if we have that in our culture anymore. We don't really. But nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it. So I'm not saying, so the other thing that people don't understand about my critique of the PMC is it's not a moral judgment. I dislike the cultural, objective, ideological aspects of this class, but it's not like, oh yeah, you're a white supremacist. It's a class position. And your class position can change. It's a position with regard to other people, other classes, and the means of production. We are very high level wage workers. We do not live on interest, except at the very top of us where we become rentiers, right? Where we live on interest. We make a living. We have to go to work. Our paychecks might be higher than the people on the bottom of the wage work scale, but this class and its dynamics with regard to the lower strata of wage workers has been terrible and deleterious towards any kind of social change since, as the Ehrenreichs would call it, the 70s. Probably around 72, when they noticed
Barbara
that
Ehrenreich you're referring to, right?
Barbara and John Ehrenreich, their 77 essay, where they said the left liberal political organizing spaces were more and more dominated by credentialed elites. And if they saw that in 77, it's 100 times intensified today. And now, like, I'll get, I'm very combative, so I'll get into Twitter fights. It's kind of silly. I do it for entertainment, but people be like, "You're a Yaley, you're a midwit Yaley," and it's like, I went to Yale, so what? Make arguments about what people are saying, not about their identity. They're so trapped in resentment and identity that they can't see that, oh yeah, you're PMC yourself. It's like, this is a position objectively within society that I occupy. You occupy a different position from me. There's nothing inimical or innately bad or good about our positions within society. The capitalist is neither bad nor good, but he does they do terrible things socially to protect their interests and increase the rate of profit. So they are the enemy of the worker. Can we see that in a way that isn't like made into a liberal passion play? We need that kind of objectivity. I get so upset though reading about private equity these days, but you just have to understand their logic and how to stop it. But we can't. We're so caught up in culture wars that we're like, oh my God, they're so evil. Let's stop it. And all of this display, the virtue signaling that I'm talking about, has replaced any kind of like objective, incisive political action or analysis. Oh my God,
Yeah.
I just talked for so long about your simple question. I'm sorry.
There's a lot to pick apart there, but I think for the audience, right, I think we should demystify parts of the argument at a time, because one of the rebuttals I always see to the PMC thesis, which I find very annoying, is when people say, well, isn't that just so this is the Marxist rebuttal, which is, well, it's not really an economic class because they're wage earners. And if they do accept that they're different from like, working class people, they'll say, well, isn't that just petite bourgeoisie or maybe labor aristocracy? And I would guess it's kind of closer to the latter, but I guess maybe what makes the PMC distinct as a class sociologically and economically, because correct me if I'm mistaken, the way I understand the PMC, it's not just literally the class position. That's a major component of it, but it's also sort of a mode, because students tend to exhibit a lot of the tendencies of PMC individuals. And I went to school with plenty of students who, they worked multiple jobs. They would be servers here, baristas there, but would exhibit all of the tendencies you would see with PMC people. But in a very literal sense, they're kind of working class, but in a sociological sense, they're closer to the PMC. And I guess all that's kind of, I would be curious for clarification, because I think people think that you're making a very like rigid class identity argument when you're not. So I want to give you the chance.
Right.
To demystify
So it's an ideological position with regard to wage work, right? That you feel like you are part of a vanguard, enlightened group of wage workers who are thought leaders with regard to the majority of the population. And this is something you're taught in college. So even if you're a barista and you've been to like gender studies seminars, you're like, yeah, I have pink hair, so I'm just more enlightened than you are. I'm just more fluid about binary oppositions than you are, which is like, I think the most identitarian vanguard PMC position you can take. But one of the things that has happened is that the ideological machinations of capital have gotten more complex. And I think that that's why I'm committed to Frankfurt School analysis, and people, the orthodox Marxists don't like this very much, but the Frankfurt School analysis of the culture industry is one way of understanding why there hasn't been a revolution under capital, because there's an ideological reproduction of the status quo, let's just use that big left phrase, and that ideological reproduction takes people and fits them like gears into the machine. So one thing that we could say about these people you're describing is that their identification is with the values are aspirational with the values of the PMC elite. So even if they're doing this work that, characterizes them as service workers, I don't know if they're blue collar, they're aspiring towards like getting a job at a publishing house, in an NGO, becoming a freelancer for, a liberal ad agency. Just their aspirations are to move. This is a transitional moment for them. And so they have to espouse the values of this class they are aspiring to enter because they have the credentials. Your generation has been screwed because the barrier to entry to these white collar jobs are more and more pronounced. Maybe not in Canada, but in the United States, it's harder and harder to get those jobs. So we have an overproduction of college educated people who are underemployed, but who identify with the values with which they've been inculcated in their elite liberal arts classes, humanities classes, which have become sites of the transmission and reproduction of this PMC ideology, which I want to go back to, which has to do with optimization of labor processes, maximization of profits for the bosses, and optimization of identity to fit into the ideological whole. And one of the ways in which this and management of such profits. So you say, well, how does that have to do with like, let's say a human rights lawyer and a finance bro? Well, both of these kinds of jobs are about manipulating symbols and numbers and can be done on a computer without any kind of physical intervention into the real world. So when the farther away you are from that physical labor of serving or of making things in the factory, the more your intellectual labor is valued, especially if you directed at managing other people and processes. So when capital was less complex, the kinds of people who managers and foremen within the family firm were on the factory floor, the foreman representing the capitalist to keep workers in line and production in to discipline the work rhythm and to keep production working smoothly. And the clerk would be working with the family as a lawyer, almost Marx says as a family servant. These two functions, the foreman becomes the engineer and the family clerk becomes the lawyer, the financier, the manager, the MBA. And both of them serve the capitalist. And this class, our class, still has that function. We break out from the rest of the workers. We use our skills to serve the capitalist class. And because there was so much social mobility in the second half of the 20th century into the first half of the 21st century, a lot of working class people became middle class white collar workers, and a lot of white collar workers, not a lot, but a tiny but significant number of them became billionaires. So almost all the holders of private equity who are billionaires today were not in their they were not born into money. The people who are born into money are hidden away. The real trust fund people, the real rentiers, the real feudal lords, we don't see them. The prominent people who are the holders of capital right now, who are dynamic and using it, like Elon Musk, like Jeff Bezos, like Leon Black, Steven Schwartzman, they can also say, we worked our way up. It was our smarts that made us this way. The holders of capital who are behind this, who really inherited wealth, as Thomas Piketty has shown, they still hold the greatest amount of wealth, but they are hidden behind, huge financial organizations and instruments. But the creation of this new wealth with private equity and with people who are really able to maximize profits by doing purely financial transactions during this period of financialization, they have accumulated so much capital that they have bought every single aspect of government and the PMC. They have bought the PMC, basically. And this can happen through their foundations, like the Getty, which controls a lot of funding in the West, where I am. Mellon has a huge endowment, $400 billion they can't even spend it down enough, but they control humanities funding. The Guggenheim, the MacArthur, all of these sort of left liberal foundations, they control cultural life, and they come out of the accumulation of incredible amounts of wealth during the first part of the 20th century. And now we're seeing that replicated in super PACs and dark money funds, but also increasingly in foundations. Like Jeff Bezos says he's going to give away $146 billion. He should have never been able to accumulate that $146 billion. But if he goes into an industry and gives them $1 billion, it doesn't help. Or an NGO, it distorts that entire world, makes people like aspiring PMC people just like go into a piranha feeding frenzy to try to get that money.
So as you alluded to with Thomas Piketty, he of course makes this distinction between the merchant right, which is sort of what you seem to be describing just now, and the Brahmin left. And I don't recall you actually citing this in your book, but I have heard you talk about it in interviews.
Yeah, I think I read it after I finished the book.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, because they really complement each other, those two studies. Because of course Piketty shows that really like part of the big shift, the big political realignment we're seeing is an educational divide. And yeah, these two camps, I guess, broad camps, the Brahmin left, the merchant right. I'd be curious for you to elaborate on that a little bit, and like what exactly the why that choice of words even is, I guess, illustrative for this phenomenon.
So for Piketty, who's looking at France mostly, and
a bunch of different Western democracies.
But the analysis of the French taxation system was what allows him to understand the question of how R is greater than G. The interest on accumulated wealth for the past 250 years is greater than growth. So if you are a rentier if you inherit money if you have wealth from the 19th century that moves through your family, the rate of interest on your wealth is faster than the rate of growth. And so this keeps a kind of almost feudal set of wealthy people in power. And then he talks about how the Brahmin left, though, as part of this world, has ossified and become a caste-like system, using the term Brahmin. Like for the Brahmin left in Piketty's terms is no longer even a class. It is a caste that reproduces its social capital, its finance capital through the generations. So there is almost no moving them anymore. There's no dynamism there. Their power is completely a fortress-like protected. And so in that sense, like he says he's not a Marxist, and he's making this observation. He's become more and more left as his career has gone on. But when you have a caste system like this, how do you overturn it? The class dynamism of capital has to do with the changing positions of the petit bourgeoisie versus the proletariat versus the lumpen proletariat, the grand bourgeoisie, and the capitalist class. And all of these are moving parts within Marx, because he's seeing capitalism move so dynamically. What Piketty might argue, and a lot of people have argued recently, Yanis Varoufakis and Jody Dean among them, is that we're evolving into a state of capitalism where it's reverted back to that feudal order. There's no dynamism anymore. There's just these fixed strata and these fixed groups within capital vying for supremacy, and their power can't be shaken by any kind of. I think Piketty he does feel like it can be shaken by electoral processes that would change the taxation system, because he's really studied the taxation system throughout the Western industrialized countries. And he says there can be redistribution if the government works properly in its way. So that is a non-revolutionary, redistributive set of policies that happened after World War II. In fact, the power of old capital in Europe was broken by World War I. The interwar period was a period of great financial crisis, and it was World War II that really broke the power of the old capitalized families in France. And then their fortunes, after a dynamic period of economic mobility, were reconsolidated.
Yeah,
So
within
the social mobility of what the French called the 30 glorious years was really facilitated by economic and taxation policies that were abandoned after neoliberalism triumphed.
Mhm. And I think what's most interesting about those two categories, Brahmin left, merchant right, is the sort of sociology of it all. And the big question, right, is why
Yeah,
is
I didn't even talk
increasingly,
about the merchant right. Like Trump would be a member of the merchant right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
or Pierre Poilievre in Canada, who's sort of the likely, most definitely going to be our next prime minister for sure.
No way. No
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. And okay, well, Trudeau, because Trudeau is like the embodiment of the Brahmin left. Well, I don't. Is he? This is kind of where I want to get at some contradictions actually, because there is a kind of way in which I've seen leftists cope with this phenomenon by saying, well, that's liberal, not leftist. But the line gets very blurry in the contemporary left when we see a lot of characteristics of the Brahmin left that are shared both by like status quo liberals, even neoliberals, who might be like third way type people like Trudeau, and then the NDP, who the NDP will be more radical, supporting taxation policies that even Piketty would probably support, except they will have all these sort of I'm really struggling to to pick the correct terms here because I want to deconstruct these terms after, but woke language. They'll have a lot of characteristics of the PMC left. So
Wait, tell me so Trudeau is not NDP. You have to explain this to me. Okay. So the NDP are to the left of Trudeau.
yes, they're like a social democratic party that
Okay.
was a neoliberal party up until recently. They started going back a little bit to their social democratic roots, but they have all the Brahmin left characteristics. Like and they're totally PMC. Like in terms of their literal makeup, it's all of them are from the academy, from professional NGO places, and
So like I think Piketty. I don't use that term Brahmin left because of the problems with translating that into the Anglo-American scene. He's talking about like the left bank leftists in France. The Socialist Party leftists who all went to the same exclusive schools, and they call themselves leftists, but like so that works in the French situation or continental Europe. I really think it's better for us to call them the Brahmin liberals here.
right.
In
But
the
this is the
Anglo-American
question,
sense.
because when I think of a Brahmin leftist or a PMC leftist, I think of
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren, who might be closer to the liberal side of things, but I also think of AOC. And
Mm,
people always like to. There's obviously a clear difference between someone like Bernie Sanders and AOC in terms of their popularity, and some people want to excuse this as solely due to sexism or racism. But
mm,
I think it's also to do with the way she lectures, the way she talks in this very kind of talking down on you mode that is very indistinguishable from Warren, in my view. Like at least in terms of their mannerisms, even if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez might support policies that are actually like pretty much similar to Bernie Sanders, but in her
so you're talking
demeanor.
like her style. Okay. So one of the things I think that she's much more willing to concede ground on, and this might be because of her generation or something, is that she's more willing to give um, space to identitarianism. So, for instance, like before she won her election, before Trump was elected, she had her pronouns on her bio on X, and then she took them
Yeah,
off.
yeah.
So there's a old left thing where Bernie Sanders never did that, right? And he just always had this kind of like message. People around him tried to adapt to these liberal identitarian rituals, and he just didn't do it. He didn't do the land acknowledgements. He kept talking about like universal programs, the people versus the power. He was, he's sort of unmovable on those points, and that's why I feel a lot of people have been criticizing him, but I just feel this kind of like perpetual gratitude towards him, because getting back to writing the book, I feel like Bernie Sanders' campaign made me realize like there is a public space for the discussion of class, and that space has been closed down by, in large part, academia and even leftists, like, prominent leftists. And we need to bring back this language of analysis, because the American working class is so objectively in trouble. And Bernie Sanders really spoke to that. And he was such a dangerous figure. Everyone had to get together in the Democratic Party and suppress him. So that's another reason why I think I was able to write that book, because I saw his old left sort of loyalty to universalism and as powerful and potentially popular too, right? Not just powerful. It was mass politics that really came up and gave me hope for the first time in my life since I was a kid. Because of the financial crisis, we were all ready to remake capitalism. Obama didn't do it, but we had this figure of Sanders who seemed to really represent a kind of old materialist politics. And so when you get, so this brings us back to AOC. I don't want to think of it as a pure generational thing, because I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at things. But I do think that the ways in which your generation and her generation were educated really makes PMC values like part of the contract that you have to sign to get your credential. And, you invisibly sign it. And then you have to like break that contract to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I will speak this language. I will say that class is just one other category of like race and gender and sexuality. I will never, put class first or something, so you're not consciously signing on, but you sign on to this. And there are many rewards in America for towing that line. And I think that's what makes it also really striking, is that there is the professional managerial class presence in the left was, for me, most felt after Bernie's defeats with DSA and the evolution of Democratic Socialists of America, and how its politics immediately became a kind of niche PMC, like had a PMC mode of being well-intentioned young people who believe that it was their role to protect, to center, to raise awareness, and were very divorced from any questions of material gain that one could work for, even in like and I'm just going to also say power, like in local politics. Like, how do you create power in local politics? This was not interesting to anyone. I hear that New York is better now. The Brooklyn DSA is much better. People are much more practical about, creating policies that, work for working class people. And then you show that you can do these things. A lot of PMC politics is more about like displaying how avant-garde you are.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. This is the part of the whole problem we're discussing that I think is the one that I think ruffles a lot of feathers, because I did a whole podcast before with Dave from Theory Underground and with another gentleman whose name just kind of went out of my memory, but it was on the professional managerial class. And one of the response we kept getting was, Well, that's identity politics. It's been co-opted by the elites, by the establishment. And what we really need is real intersectionality. And I notice in your book, you also critique intersectionality. And I think this is the division that to me is more interesting because as it pertains to leftists, because a lot of leftists cope with this by saying, well, see, Hillary Clinton, their kind of wokeism is phony wokeism. It's phony identity politics. And what we really need is this grassroots race, class, gender, popular front of the vulnerable, whatever you may call it. And, but they kind of have that same, like the working class tends to find them just as out of touch as the
Well,
liberals
I'm
in
going to
some regard.
focus on that word vulnerable.
Uh-huh.
And that is the fetish
Yeah.
of liberals and people. They fetishize vulnerability. They reify it and they make it seem like, oh, we're helping the vulnerable. We are vulnerable. We can save people. No, a real working class movement emphasizes strength. And I'm so fucking sick of the vulnerability fetish. My God, we're all so need. No, that's not leftist politics. That's liberal politics. If you fetishize vulnerability, that's liberal politics. Yes, we need to protect the health of all Americans because, and I don't know about Canada, but Americans are abused by big food and big ag. This country is sick. RFK Jr., like as crazy as it is, he realizes that it's industrial agriculture that's made people so sick. But the thing is that to fight against it is not to emphasize our vulnerability, but to emphasize the strength in numbers that can actually make a change in the organization of big ag. It feels so desperate when we're all alone with these ideas or trying to round up a group of people and make and alive with them. We have people, they love micro and niche projects. And this is what's just making me so depressed about left liberal politics right now, is that this fetishism for vulnerability. The book that I wrote about trauma is going to come out with this much more clearly articulated, but the very notion of political subjectivity has to change in order for us to be able to build anything that looks like a revolution. Because if you're going to be fetishizing each other's vulnerabilities and demanding recognition from each other all the time so that you're become mutual etiquette police, you will never, ever change a goddamn thing. You have no idea how powerful capital is. And if you're going to be like, well, asking for recognition because you're vulnerable, you are fucked. And they fucked you already, and you're fucked. About the creation of any kind of strength or autonomy or agency through solidarity, that has to be remade. And you know what? I'm not optimistic for this generation, your generation, or the next. They were fucked by coronavirus. Like, how are we going to actually produce a kind of comity of people who find strength and ambition together, a collective ambition to change the world, rather than individualized grievances that collect as a set of grievances for which we demand recognition? Vulnerability was actually the word that was the critical word here. Great.
Very well said. You articulated kind of my gripe with this phenomenon way better than I could have, because I remember sometimes arguing with leftists on what I thought would be common sense ideas. Like, for example, it's like open borders in a global capitalist economy is a very stupid idea, and it would be a kind of a wet dream to people who would want to exploit cheap legal migrant labor. And then they were saying, no, the idea of an illegal itself is a fascist concept. And I was thinking about, like, okay, even if you believe that one day in hypothetical communist world you want to get rid of borders and nations, okay, whatever, as a political strategy right now, it's a pretty silly idea to emphasize open borders. And they said, but we can't give up on the vulnerable, and they're more vulnerable. And you hear this a lot with the issues like trans issues and all kind of different issues where So I'm very libertarian on like those kind of
Can't
issues.
give up on the vulnerable.
Yeah, well, it's like I had an argument with a sort of PMC leftist once, and I said, okay, like why not take the strategy of you can be pro trans rights, but maybe don't like put the most fringe trans issues on the front of your platform and talk about that more than the issues where you might have popularity on. And they said, no, that's seizing ground to the right, and that is going to damage the vulnerable. And my God, like,
Most of my trans friends really hate the fact that the liberals have weaponized that issue in this particular way. So when you pretend to speak for the vulnerable, you are taking the most PMC position, because when a true mass politics comes to being, or when the revolution happens, it's only because of the strength of the masses, and not people going, oh, peasants, you really suffered. Is like the inspiring thing about Mao's revolution, about Lenin's revolution, was the power that people saw in themselves reflected in the masses, and in their ability to change things. A lot of things didn't change in both, Bolshevik Russia and communist China, but there's certainly, you liberated like 300 million serfs from serfdom and 800 million peasants from absolute dire poverty and debt peonage to landlords. So there was a whole reorganization of the productive forces of a population, and and there was redistribution. It didn't work out perfectly, and it's still in process in China. In Russia, it's all oligarchical now. But when you think about like a class war, you don't wage it by saying we have to, you know, be vulnerable and then expect other people. It's like a blackmail when you say, oh, yes, we're protecting the vulnerable. And if you criticize me, you're criticizing the vulnerable. That's like the total liberal blackmail. It's like, no, we have to find strategies to build mass politics, putting strength on strength. And what you were saying about common sense is that PMC vanguardists hate common sense. They hate it.
They love this word heteronormativity. They
I know.
hate heteronormativity.
Right. They hate normativity. But the other thing I was thinking about was that in the most extreme cases, they want to punish you for apperceptive responses, like stimuli responses. This is why it is an etiquette straitjacket, is that they want you to feel completely inhibited when dealing with other people, for fear of offending them. It's really, truly horrifying.
Yeah.
Because we live in such antisocial times already. But if you are going to create a new net of etiquette in which you can catch offenders, then you just give up on normal people, ordinary people who are just who are trying to survive and who are looking for some kind of social bond that will make them feel less alone with regard to all the powerful forces that are working against them. From our foodways to our work culture to our healthcare system.
Does that tie into academic anti-elitism a little bit? Because what I find interesting is in academia, it's filled with a lot of people who are against stuff like standards, education standards, or teaching aspects of history because they might be offensive to the vulnerable, as if Black people are so not intelligent that they would can't look at a Jefferson statue without being traumatized. It's so infantilizing and almost kind of more racist sometimes than what they criticize.
The thing that I was looking at when I wrote American Idol was that there's kind of anti-canon animus in the academy, like we have to destroy the traditions, we can't look at the Enlightenment, we can't read the classics because we can only read like what's popular and edgy as part of our political expression. Is that when you looked at the emancipation of the African Americans and the establishment of African American schools, there was a real bifurcation where Booker T. Washington wanted people to have vocational training, but people like W.E.B. Du Bois and other, we'd say like bourgeois elite African Americans, they wanted training in the classics, and they wanted like classical humanities education along with scientific, speculative, thematic education for African Americans, and not just applied like what we'd have today, like computer science is supposed to just get you that job, or business. Like the aspirations that the PMC elites thought people wanted was just like things that were quote unquote relatable. That was not a grassroots aspiration. That was something that came up with the rise of this kind of niche liberalism, that there is this human civilization is everyone's legacy. And to keep people in a state of ignorance with regard to human civilizational achievements like Newtonian physics, that is the most insulting thing of all. There's nothing about physics that is, oppressive intersectionally. Everyone should have access to objective reason, scientific method, and its history. And I think that by fetishizing both vulnerability and irrationality, we're doing people who are already oppressed and marginalized a huge disservice. Like, we shouldn't be so bogged down in this kind of non-normativity that comes out of this Foucault fetish that people have, and think about like established norms. You can criticize them, but you have to know the laws of physics. There's no way of subverting that. I mean, when you get to quantum mechanics, you have to have known Euclidean physics, Newtonian physics. I read some more recently that the most translated book into African languages is the Bible. And the African elites are saying, this is how you keep us down. Like, we need science. We need scientific translation. And we need scientific text being translated into all the different African languages. But you keep translating the Bible, because all these evangelical Christians and missionaries, they have grants, translation grants, and they keep translating the Bible for these various tribes. And it's like keeping people in a state of irrationality, in a state of religious subjection. That is not good. And it's the same thing, I'm sorry to say, for you Canadians and your fetish of First Nations. First Nations were deprived of their land, deprived of their dignity, but there is nothing like absolutely beyond criticism about maintaining this kind of irrationality in a worldview that is deeply mythological and superstitious. And the other thing is, that has real serious problems in terms of gender equity. So what the white person's fantasy of the indigenous religions and this kind of caretaking of the land has to do with is a fetish of non-development, pre-industrialization, pre-enlightenment world. And to cast them in that world means to deprive them of the objective achievements of scientific progress. I know I've just alienated all these Canadians. You're probably going to get
no. This is Canadian. The silent majority of Canadians all agree, and even not even the silent majority, even some of the PMC people. I remember when there was one academic. He's the guy who wrote that not so great book, in my opinion, on how fascism works. Jason Stanley. Yeah, on Twitter, he made a very common sense tweet saying, "Look, people I talk to in this space, all of us see a problem with this kind of like wokeism." Which I kind of want to ask you a little bit about how you might define, because I notice it's a little bit of an ambiguous concept, but we kind of like have an instinctual idea of what it is, a lot of us. And he was saying, Jason Stanley, that, a lot of us privately hate this stuff, and it's had a terrible effect on the education system, but we are afraid to speak about it because you'll have people in this very competitive PMC educational space where it's really hard to get jobs as a professor. Everyone's stuck as an adjunct, and good luck getting tenure, right? It's very hard. Yeah. So people who are competing for these positions will be so quick to participate in a cancellation, right, or sort of defamation of another character, so that they can kind of ascend or get rid of competition. I guess that's a subconscious motivation, I think. But he was saying that, and I view in Canada too, tons of people think the same thing. There's a kind of very phony land acknowledgement culture in which it's all about guilt, it's all about trauma. Meanwhile, we still build pipelines on indigenous land and don't even, a lot of indigenous communities like in BC and Alberta don't even have access to clean drinking water. So it's a total disgrace. Like the governments aren't doing anything for the people they are supposed to represent. But this sort of PMC kind of permaculture, it's like weirdly filtered into parts of the radical left, I noticed too. What is one of the most disappointing things is when I meet a Marxist and they say, well, Canada and America, they're settler colonial countries. They just need to be totally balkanized and land back completely. It sounds like a straw man, sounds ridiculous, but these people do exist.
I know.
And they kind of say, well, the idea of even having like appealing to any sense of like unity and nationhood, it's bad, and you can't do that because you have bad things you did. You can't even appeal to pride because you should feel guilty about everything, and it's definitely had a negative effect. But I guess I was going to ask something about moral relativism, but I guess wokeness, since we're on it, how do you define wokeness? Because
I don't actually
think that's just
term.
a right wing myth.
No, I don't actually ever use that term. I don't. I think it like it's a really problematic term. People try to criticize it, go crazy. I've been reading Norman Finkelstein's book, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Come to It. And it's a critique of wokeism, but I think it drove him insane. So I think that it's better to call it like hyper subjectivity, hyper identitarianism, or hyper subjective reason as the governing principle of all social interaction. Like everything is about your subjective experience of your own vulnerability when it comes to like a social situation. I'm sorry, it's not very like doesn't trip off the tongue, but I also feel like it's about the reification of identities as such and the human resource management of difference. So I try to put it back into like a managerial workplace issue.
Wouldn't virtue signaling be like, I see like your discussion on virtue signaling as the main aspect of wokeism.
Yeah. Okay, let's call it performative virtue signaling then. Performative politics. Let's call it pure performative politics. Yeah. And
some people say that's also a right-wing boogeyman, virtue signaling, but you talk a lot about that. I mean, why does that matter?
I don't care, but what I'm trying to figure out, actually, Tony, is how to articulate the position of the anti-liberal left. Because being anti-liberal makes people think, oh, you're just a right-winger, but we have to have an anti-liberal left position on things. That's what I'm trying to articulate.
I'm even critical of that too.
Oh, okay. Why?
I guess it makes sense in the American context, because in the American context, like liberal means like progressive, big government, sort of like pseudo progressivism. But I also think in the more like Enlightenment liberal sense, there's a lot of it actually, I think that is part of the problem of what we've lost. Like I think a lot of the moral relativism.
Okay.
And a lot of the
anti-small L liberal.
Yeah.
Small L, not big L.
I see. Well, yeah, I get what you mean. Because like I'll have people I meet who I think I agree with. They'll be like, yeah, these shit libs, they'll be against them, but then they'll kind of have that same sort of like, the US should be balkanized, America and Canada, there's all a bunch of settlers, and they'll give up on the working class and kind of implicitly or explicitly endorse a sort of fetishized third worldism, which, you sound like strawmans, but the more communists I've met, the more I've seen that. And that's when I really realized this was actually a problem. It's not just a matter of someone not being radical enough. Some of the radicals are totally have this sort of mind virus also.
Yes. Well, we can't use those terms anymore. Okay, anti-liberal left doesn't work for you. Okay. They've had, anti-woke left, anti-identitarian. I just feel like there's
hard.
Yeah.
I'm with you on the wokeism being a difficult term because of the right kind of will use it to incorporate just like any kind of left-wing politics, any kind of social justice politics. And they will sometimes, not always, but sometimes actually be against like progress of the civil rights movement and the women's movement. Whereas a lot of people, I don't think, mean that. But the problem is, I do think the term is important because leftists so often sweep it under the rug. They'll say this is just a right-wing attack, and we don't need to deal with this. But it's really hard to find a master signifier to tie all these phenomena that you
And you think
Piketty, and
wokeism does that? Woke does that? Yeah. I mean,
it's
maybe.
not a perfect term.
No.
But
But
I try to go where the masses go.
I'd like
The
to figure
masses
out.
do use it. And
This is not. Yeah, it's not my project right now, but I think the best thing to do would be to look at how it's used historically, like where it comes from, how it evolves, um, uh, how it functions as an anti-class strategy within the left to police and put down class problems of class. Because the thing about the settler colonial argument and the balkanization is that it totally takes out any idea that there might be classes within the settler population, people who never got very much from being a settler and who work for the profit of the capitalists who settled. And so that, like, the elimination of class distinction within the within whites, even, that is I don't know, like, you want to call that wokeism? Okay, I'll concede that, but I just think it's reactionary. There's nothing liberatory. There's nothing critical about that position. When you erase the class distinctions like that,
right.
and you make it into just one, you create a demographic that is iniquitous, without making a class distinction. Like when you think about women, think about like second wave feminism, for instance. The fact that there were working class women, they totally ignored. And that's how they produce this kind of like woke feminism.
You talk a
But
lot about
it's not a battle like I'm gonna have. Norman Finkelstein went so far in that book. I kind of agree with him, but I think it's so bad the way that it's come to dominate institutional, personal, and political relations, this kind of hyper-vigilance about offense. And if you want to call that wokeness, that's okay. That I just think it just really sucks. And it really is a kind of liberalism. And you're right to say small L liberalism that wants to adjudicate difference over material contradictions. And it's like a very complicated way of saying that, but it's the only way I can figure out how to confront it.
I see.
It has no the other thing that, in a more analytic way I could talk about is that within this kind of woke interaction, the superego is a totally PMC human resources manager.
Right. Exactly. That's the PMC mode. Like in the sense that people weren't actually
You're pleasing that person.
managers, but they, yeah.
Yeah, who are you pleasing? Who are you talking to when you take that red lib position?
Yeah, they say words like we need to be united. We can't cede ground to the right. It's like we, this big other of like a left, and who's part of this imaginary left. It's almost like a PMC cathedral. I mean, this is what I'm careful
coercive.
too. That sounds like right-wing arguments, but does that not exist, right? Like I didn't think this existed because this is kind of brings us to distinction between the right and left PMC. I kind of went to school originally that was sort of right-wing PMC or centrist PMC. It was very like technocrat, managerial, policy analysis, like center, the line go up, and that's why homeless people need to still be homeless. Right. Whereas I didn't quite see the problem with that. The left was like in the academy of this sort of like hyper liberal, hyper progressive, woke left, wherever we want to call it.
Right.
I didn't see it was a problem until I went into grad school, where I actually wanted to like study with Marxists and stuff like that.
Right.
Whereas like, oh, I was very surprised to see all that. And I was like, oh, there's some of this stuff I've heard about the left and the academy is true.
Yeah.
And okay, so we're talking about rejection of universalism, and that's part of the reason why I tend to prefer like hyper progressive as opposed to hyper liberal, just because so much of the left today is very illiberal in terms
That's
of literally
right.
handling
That's
of contradiction,
absolutely right.
canceling
That's
people.
absolutely right.
But also, you talk so much about the rejection of universalism. I kind of want you to elaborate on that. Why is that actually a bad thing? Because moral relativism has traditionally usually been critiqued by the right. Like the right usually critiques moral relativism, like Leo Strauss, for example. But why is that actually a problem? Because some people will say, well, Foucault and Nietzsche, they say that it's all about power, and that's true. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of critique of Foucault and Nietzsche because Foucault really wanted to replace the Marxist paradigm. Nietzsche has a great critique of Christianity and the Christian will to power, and really tries to create a kind of a sense of positive sovereignty in a time of industrialization and standardization. And his worldview is purely aristocratic, and that's very appealing. As Foucault is very appealing when you think that you can just talk power, that's power. You can identify power and denounce it. Nietzsche has this aristocratic sensibility. It's about creating the sovereign agent. For Marx, there are objective situations within history that have to do with material struggles for supremacy with regard to the means of production and the means of subsistence. These are objective things that can't be reduced to my subjective experience or power. In fact, Nietzsche, from a Marxist point of view, could be understood as a bourgeois, brilliant mind who was trying to create a kind of Superman out and escape from the standardization that he saw coming through the rationalization of work in the capitalist workplace. So that is very appealing because we are all being punished by this kind of increasingly regimented, disciplined workplace. I mean, since the 19th century, our work is more surveilled, our freedoms are less and less possible. And the two of them we're thinking about is kind of freedom, right? The freedom of bondage and sadomasochism, sexual perversion, non-normativity with Foucault maybe, and Nietzsche, pure aristocratic will to power that renounces Christianity and the virtues. Totally appealing. What Marx was looking at was the fact that for most of human existence, the working class and the peasant, not even the working class yet, the peasants, the majority of people had short, brutish lives. The conversion of the means of production within agriculture and industrial production produced both new forms of oppression, but the possibility of liberating people from short, brutish lives. And within the Enlightenment, one of the things that had to do with scientific observation, and they used this, and experimentation was the introduction of the smallpox vaccine, which changed the survival rate of children from before vaccine, after vaccine in an enormous way, and also improved the lives of women because they didn't have to give birth to so many children so that one could survive. That process of rationalization and scientific method did not come out of nowhere. It came out of certain principles of experimentation, objective observation of phenomena, and rationalization. That rationalization has turned into instrumental reason so that we use it to extract profit and oppress people as much as possible. But none of these things are possible without the exercise of objective reason and an agreement between human beings that we live in a shared reality which can be observed and measured. And that is universal. The universal exercise of reason and the scientific method doesn't change if you move from one latitude to another. Gravity is still gravity. Light still operates like light.
Mhm. I think to sum up in one sentence, the kind of difference between the non-universalist left and I guess you could say aspects of the classically Marxist left is the new left is all about difference as such, like a fetishization of difference. Different things are different, and the they're against the grand narratives that Marxism has. And even if like we are to accept, which I don't really, but even if we were to accept that the postmodernists or post-structuralists, to be more accurate, I guess, are true, are correct in like that aspect of like being truth being really hard to nail down, it's a total disaster politically. Like it's the worst political strategy imaginable. I mean, you tell people like to not have any kind of grand narrative, to be against sort of common standards instead of a sort of universal um, grand narrative. You go for this intersectionality, which I'm sympathetic to those folks because they will add class to the equation, unlike the Hillary Clinton neoliberal identity politics people. So they at least talk about class, but they do it in this way where it's like they feel every time you mention class, you have to mention gender, you have to mention race, you have to mention all this. And if you object to that framework, they think the argument you're making is that you are saying we shouldn't care about race and gender, which is, I don't think that's the argument you're making.
No, not at all. But I do think that we're in a dark moment, but if you think about things in a more epic historical manner, the life expectancy in China in 1900 was 30. It was before the first Chinese Revolution. The life expectancy in the United States was 37. The United States now has seen a period of time when its life expectancy as an industrialized nation has gone down. That was the only time we've seen that happen is in Russia, in the breakup of the Soviet Union. So in terms of public health and public well-being for the masses, there's been incredible accomplishments in the 20th century and the 21st century. And I don't know if you want to call that a grand narrative, but there has been an epic amount of transformation in terms of the liberation of the majority of human beings on Earth from absolute abject poverty. Now, there is absolute abject poverty in great parts of the world, but Marx really felt that capitalism would unleash the productive potential of human beings so that we could give everyone the possibility of enjoying the leisure time and the life conditions of the bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm.
And that could only be done through the transformation of the productive powers that capitalism unleashed in the 19th century. And yes, there was terrible colonialism that allowed for exploitation of all the British colonies. They were the main empire at the time. But if we want to be anti-imperial, we can't trust ourselves to just be micro niche types. We have to have a bigger plan and a bigger vision. So it's not even the difference thing I'm just tired of, but it's not even that in terms of the historical narrative. It's not even grand narrative. What's embedded in Marxism and historical materialism is an epic view of the human struggle for liberation.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Like epic spanning thousands of years about the transformation of different modes of production from hunter-gatherer to agricultural to feudal to early mercantile, first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution. Like that's an incredible view of history that everyone should understand. We're all part of it.
Mm-hmm.
To post-industrial capital. Do you understand what I'm saying then?
Yeah.
It's fucking epic. Yeah. We're talking millennia of history. It's not just this past 100 years, but we've got to understand our position in that. And we don't, because no one has any historical imagination. And capital has wanted to destroy it. And you know what? This is my problem with a lot of theory heads too, is that the understanding of history is extraordinarily shallow. You know what makes and the way history is taught is extremely boring. But if you think about it from an epic struggle for dignity, for liberate, for mastery of the world, it's fucking epic what we've accomplished. It's amazing we've survived this long. I don't know that we'll survive much longer, to be perfectly honest. But it's pretty incredible. And instead of being like, oh yeah, we're just settler colonialists, we're so bad, that's white supremacy. It's like, let's look at this as part of a human struggle to liberate people from abject poverty and subsistence reproduction of the systems of life to a kind of leisure and intellectual autonomy and agential mastery over their world. So let's take something of what Nietzsche wanted and free everyone, not just like the exceptional few, but free everyone from the oppression of work discipline and standardization.
Very well said. I think one of the best examples of that epic history, like works of epic history, is Neil Faulkner's The Radical History of the Worlds, a book that I'm not quite finished yet because it's enormous, but I love the way he tells history because he tells it through a Marxist lens, but it's very detailed and it's very rigorous, and it's kind of it's the antithesis of the problems I've had of the ways leftists have taught history recently with these kind of certain tendencies I've seen come out of post-colonialism, which will say that Marx's view of history is ethnocentric and completely like a good example actually is certain academics who have sort of tried to or not even academics, certain journalists, some one of which you mentioned in your book, try to portray the American Revolution as actually like just a counter revolution by slavers and nothing else without a impact. It was, and of course, looking at history in that first not very historically accurate view, but in that sort of view divorced from any kind of narrative of its global significance, it undermines even that Marxist narrative. And a lot of the times they'll explicitly say that. They'll say, well, this wasn't you can't view this progress if it had some disemancipations along the way. If blacks suffered, you can't say that there was anything progressive about this event, right? They have to look at like teaching history in this activist way that is more about reducing how much pain you cause people or how much pain you think you might evoke in telling that history than the actual accuracy and holistic significance of it as a whole, right?
Yeah, it's a kind of anachronistic application of woke politics onto the past. And that's part of the ahistoricism and the historical amnesia that's promoted by like woke retellings of history. Want to use woke or liberal, like
PMC.
neoliberal or whatever, like really bad neoliberal PMC modified views of it. But that has been rewarded by that view, that bad history has been rewarded by a lot of the most powerful cultural agencies in America.
New
I
York
don't know about Canada, but in America, it's like, yay, that's good history. It's like telling a story of micro experiences and making claims about grievance that work on PMC white guilt. And we need better history, or we won't have history as a as a way of understanding the present any longer, and then we'll just be sleepwalking into the future and embedded in infernal repetition, which is, I think, what we're going for now. The way that the Democrats are so trapped in their technocratic authoritarianism just makes me think, oh, we're going to cycle through populism and technocracy, populism and technocracy. There doesn't seem to be a way out. And the only way to understand this cycle, I think, is to step out of the whole thing and see a longer historical progression.
I have so many funny things I want to ask related to that, but we'll save that for the back room. The last question I just want to ask for the public segment. real quick is, because I forgot to ask at the beginning, was the difference between, is there a right and left PMC? Because like people who come out of the academy, for instance, and people who might work for corporate advertising might have very different worldviews. And even engineers, people who work engineers at Google, for example, are kind of PMC. But there's something kind of different. Like I think a lot of the PMC that we're talking about is very much the academy and NGO world. But I'm curious, to what extent
and
are there like
corporate,
different factions?
all of the banks and everything, they accepted a lot of these identitarian categories. The right-wing right-wing managerialism wants to give space for a kind of explosive entrepreneurial sensibility that is like Thiel or Musk. And they still trust expertise, and they still need their credentials, but they want to break through this bureaucracy and this kind of like what they think of as this oppressive managerial regulatory state that's suppressing this explosive, inventive, carnivalesque figure that Trump has become. Like, they enjoy life, they understand risk taking, and the left liberal elites are just embedded in this regulatory dynamic that's all about suppressing their creativity and their explosive, future-oriented, accomplishment-fueled ideas. But this, capital-fueled ideas. But both represent two different faces of proposing that capitalism is the best mode of human production. So within the PMC and the regulatory state, you have like the credentialed institutions, the media, academia, which are really being questioned right now because of COVID, because of Trump, because of all the corruption that is taking place. But they say that they can preserve within this regulatory machinery and the credential machinery a market-free space that has professional standards, like professors and doctors and lawyers. We're free from the marketplace pressures. It was absolute bullshit. We are completely oppressed by the rules of the marketplace now, but that we create a better kind of form of capitalism because we protect certain kinds of expertise from the depredations of a marketplace that is managed for maximum growth. Then you have this idea on the right that you just have these geniuses who have, these tech ideas, engineering ideas, X, Tesla, eBay, and they're just creating wealth and they're creating dynamic growth, and they're delivering information to us in all these different ways, and they're subverting and they're reacting to you all the time by putting down the left PMC through this, right-wing dynamism. And Trump has become their avatar, right? Like, he's this sort of rules breaker and just this sovereign agent, and he's going to, fuck things up and fuck up the government. And because that's the best way capitalism works, is if you just let a few individuals unleash their potential and their ideas, step back, let the losers lose, let the winners win, let the winners take the most stuff. And it's still a mode of management. It's a mode of management that minimizes regulation, but somebody's still managing these engineers and these workers in terms of workflow and everything else. It's just saying that this mode of management for the dynamic, aristocratic, libertarian visionary is more efficient for capital. And the left PMC is like, no, our pseudo-regulatory liberal institutions, that's the best for capital because we are democratic. And the other side, and we represent the democratic institutions. The other side is like, no, you guys hate the people, which is somewhat true. And we really represent the spirit of the people. They're going to come into a lot of problems because MAGA, and as we've seen, the tech billionaires have different interests. But so far, they've made an alliance. The Dems, I don't think they understand this, out of pure hatred of the liberal left PMC. Their politics are about the pure hatred of the left liberal values that have been dominant hegemonically in academia, in the government, in NGO world, in media, in Hollywood, in journalism. They've had a lot of power. And the people on the bottom who fucking hate them. And then there are like a couple of billionaires who realized we can weaponize this hate. And it's worked. And the Democratic pundits are like, I don't know, man. Harris's numbers were pretty high at the end of the thingy, and we really focused on 7 states, and her numbers really went up in those 7 swing states. They have no idea how much people hate them.
But you see, it's because she's a Black woman. She's a woman of color, and people in America are just too backward to accept that. And what do we do with that? Nothing, but we'll just say that as an excuse.
You're doubling down. This is why we're just going to cycle between the regulatory state and this like kind of Nietzschean free market tiering. But actually, it is 2:30, and I have to get to cooking. Okay, let's do 10 minutes of behind the paywall.
Yeah,
okay.
We'll transition to the back room right now. If you're not part of the back room already, you get access to tons of very interesting conversations. And it's cheaper than the price of a Starbucks latte. So stop buying that shit and become a patron of One Dime Radio.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra